Folks, of all the great stories that are out there, I would have to say that Lord of the Rings is by far my favorite, and I would have to say that Tolkien is without question my favorite author. The world that he created, Middle-earth Arda, is so richly detailed. It's got such a long history to it, with many great tales and legends. I like the characters in Lord of the Rings, I like the themes of Lord of the Rings. Themes like good and evil, courage, friendship, and so on and so forth. And because Lord of the Rings is my favorite story and because Tolkien is my favorite author, you can imagine that anytime there's some news coming out regarding what Amazon is doing to the works of Tolkien, you can imagine that I would have quite a bit to say about it. So we had a little story come out earlier this week where the director for The Rings of Power Season 2, Charlotte Brandstrom, I guess she gave a little interview. I'm on thatparkplace.com. Lord of the Rings of Power director Charlotte Brandstrom bemoans Tolkien fans judging the show before it came out. Now, I'm not going to read this entire article. I'll just give you the meat of it and what she said. The interview here was with Drama Quarterly. She's kind of reflecting on the first season of Rings of Power, which that show was not an adaptation of Tolkien's work. That was a desecration of Tolkien's work. And she talks about her story and some projects that she'd been working on, but here's a big part of the interview. So she was asked, how do you look back on making Season 1 of The Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power, and what was it like coming back to lead Season 2? Brandstrom responded, I love the episodes I did in Season 1, I was very proud of them. I spent a lot of time with the showrunners on the look and on the characters to see what we could improve, what is changing, what people want to see. You don't sit there and think constantly about how massive it is because it would scare you a lot. She then stated, the sad thing is a lot of people had judged the show before it even came out, so that was actually tough. But then you try to adapt to see what they are really looking for. Some fans were mixing Peter Jackson's films with Tolkien's work, and we've been trying to stay true to Tolkien and give it a really cool look, Brandstrom elaborated. No, you were not trying to stay true to Tolkien's work. Peter Jackson's movies, yeah, there were some changes made, there were some things cut out. Tom Bombadil was cut out, Crick Hollow was cut out, The Old Forest was cut out, Fog on the Barrow. The way the Lord of the Rings story ended was Gollum gets the ring from Frodo and then he's jumping up and down celebrating and he doesn't realize he's getting close to falling over the edge into the lava and he ends up falling in. Frodo doesn't fight and push him in. Yeah, there were some changes that Peter Jackson did make, but overall there's no question Peter Jackson respected Tolkien and that he tried to honor Tolkien's work. Amazon did not try to honor Tolkien's work. I'll go a little more into that shortly. But the big quote here is the sad thing is a lot of people judged the show before it even came out, so that was tough. Okay, let me tell you why fans judged the show before it came out. We the fans have been seeing a trend in entertainment over the last, 10, 15 years, where every property is going woke or being current date or being made to reflect the real world that we live in today. People in Hollywood are injecting their ideologies into other people's works. They're turning other people's works into platforms. There's an obsession over diversity and diversity quotas, which are basically being implemented in every adaptation that's being made now. Even though there are some stories out there where it does not make sense, like Lord of the Rings, for example, which is based on European mythology and is a story that Tolkien explicitly meant as a mythology for England. The Greek mythologies, they survived through the years. The Norse mythologies, the Eddas, they survived through the years. In Finland, the Kalevala survived. But Tolkien lamented the fact that England's mythology did not survive through the years. Tolkien, when he created Lord of the Rings, he meant it to be a mythology for his home country of England. And then another trend that we're seeing is that every female character needs to be turned into a strong woman girl boss. Every male character needs to either be a beta male, needs to be weak, or he needs to be evil and he needs to be put in his place by a strong female character. You see that happen quite a bit now. But fans have been noticing these trends over the past, 10, 12, 15, whatever years, and they don't like it. The fans do not like the fact that studios are taking over the works of authors and creators, and then they're turning those works into platforms. The fans don't like it, the fans are sick of it. They've seen it happen in Star Wars, Star Trek, Marvel now, Doctor Who, comics. A lot of video games have been doing this too. There's a long list of properties and stories that have gone woke, and it's gotten to a point where while 20, 25, whatever years ago, whenever they announced a movie or a TV adaptation of a story, fans would generally get excited and look forward to it. Now whenever they announce that they're bringing a story to the big screen, fans dread it. Because fans have seen this woke pattern so often now that the moment an adaptation is announced, we can pretty much guess what's going to happen. we can predict that it's going to be vandalized, and that it's going to be turned into a platform for the studio's ideology. And fans have seen this happen so often now that they've reached a point where they are done, quote-unquote, waiting till the show or movie comes out and giving it a chance. Back when we got a first look for The Rings of Power Season 1, which premiered on the anniversary of Tolkien's death, the executive producer for the series, Lindsay Weber, said, "It felt only natural to us that an adaptation of Tolkien's work would reflect what the world actually looks like. Tolkien is for everyone. His stories are about his fictional races doing their best work when they leave the isolation of their own cultures and come together." Now this first quote here that she said, "It felt only natural that Tolkien's work would reflect what the world looks like," fans have reached a point where the moment we see statements like this, we're out. We already know where the show's going. We know it's going to be going woke, it's going to be getting current dayed, and at that point we're not giving you our attention or our money. And then the other comment that I want to make about this quote. "It felt only natural that an adaptation of Tolkien's work would reflect what the real world looks like." Ladies and gentlemen, fantasy, by its very definition, does not reflect what the real world looks like. Let me repeat that. Fantasy, by its very definition, does not reflect what the world looks like. That's why it's called fantasy, because it's not real. Fantasy is not meant to reflect the real world. That's why it's fantasy. And then she says Tolkien is for everyone. Yeah, it's always been for everyone. His works have been translated into I don't know how many languages at this point. His works are loved by people of all races, creeds, religions. And these fans didn't just wake up one day and say, "Hey look, Amazon's making an adaptation of Tolkien's work and in it I can finally see myself on screen. I'm a Tolkien fan now." No, they didn't do that. And then she says his stories are about his fictional races doing their best work when they leave the isolation of their own cultures and come together. If you were to ask me the themes of Tolkien's work, and I won't go into detail on it, but there was one letter he wrote where he spoke of three things: fall, mortality, and machine. I would say those are the deeper themes of Tolkien's work. And on the subject of the Rings of Power director bemoaning the fact that Lord of the Rings fans were judging the show before it came out, there's an interview George R. R. Martin gave a couple years ago before the Rings of Power show came out. And it's an interview that I often like to go back to. Now this was from The Independent. "I don't understand how people can come to hate so much something that they once loved." And he says, "I don't understand how people could come to hate so much something that they once loved. If you don't like a show, don't watch it. How has everything become so toxic?" Now on the subject of if you don't like the show, don't watch it, Forbes.com, Rings of Power was a massive flop that most viewers gave up on. And here's stating that only 37% of people who started watching the show actually finished it. That's just over a third of the audience. How has everything become so toxic? Well, it's become toxic because the studios have taken every franchise out there and turned it into a platform. And then when fans don't like the fact that they're doing that, these studios, they attack the fans, they gaslight the fans, they call fans names, certain istophobe words, and then fans decide, alright, we're not going to give you our money. And then the fans get called toxic when in reality it's actually the people working at the studios who are toxic. And then we have this quote from him right here: "The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power isn't even on yet. But if you follow what's going on online, controversy around it is like World War II, they're dropping atomic bombs on each other." He says incredulously of the fans who howl about any perceived deviation from the source material. No, it's not perceived deviation from the source material, it's deviation from the source material. But he continues, "You hear controversies about some of the Marvel shows and the Marvel movies, certainly about the DC characters. It used to be that if you were a fan of Star Trek, you liked Star Trek. Now it seems like half the people who call themselves Star Trek fans hate Star Trek, and the Star Wars fans hate Star Wars, and the Tolkien fans hate Rings of Power. What the hell?" Now maybe it's because it's changing, but as a writer you'd go crazy if you didn't change it somehow. You want to tell new stories, not to tell the same stories over and over again. Okay, now him saying that Lord of the Rings fans hate Rings of Power, Star Wars fans hate Star Wars, and so on and so forth, let me say a few things here. Number one, being a fan of a certain story or a certain property does not mean that you're going to blindly consume anything and everything made under that brand name. Secondly, and most importantly, a fan of whatever property or franchise, in this case Lord of the Rings. A fan of Lord of the Rings is going to be avidly reading the books, reading the Silmarillion, and so on and so forth. But a fan of Lord of the Rings is going to be very knowledgeable of Lord of the Rings. A Tolkien fan is going to be very knowledgeable of Tolkien's work, and because Lord of the Rings fans are very knowledgeable of Tolkien's work, they are able to very easily recognize when that work is being utterly desecrated and destroyed, which is exactly what Amazon is purposely doing to Lord of the Rings. And all Tolkien fans are doing is calling a spade a spade. All they're doing is calling it as it is. And then the next quote he gives here, now maybe it's because it's changing, but as a writer you'd go crazy if you didn't change it somehow. You want to tell new stories, not tell the same stories over and over again. This is another statement where Martin is out of touch. So the Rings of Power was meant to be a portrayal of the Second Age of Middle-earth. So when Lord of the Rings fans hear that, and those fans have read the Silmarillion, they know what happens during the Second Age, they're going to expect an adaptation that is accurate to how Tolkien wrote the Second Age. The audience is not going to want you to make changes to the original author's work, because the original author's work was what made him a fan of that franchise in the first place. And the fans especially are not going to want to see studios turning these works into platforms for their own political ideologies. George R. R. Martin says that as a writer you'd go crazy if you didn't change a story somehow. Okay, look, George R. R. Martin, he has his own story, A Song of Ice and Fire, or a TV show known as Game of Thrones. But the book series is A Song of Ice and Fire. That's his story, and to be quite frank, I think most people out there at this point don't think he's going to finish that story. But that is his story. If he wants to make changes to his own story, he can go right ahead. But with Lord of the Rings, the writer in question for Lord of the Rings, he passed away 50 years ago. Tolkien is not alive and able to defend his work. And his son Christopher, God love Christopher Tolkien, but Christopher Tolkien, he also is no longer alive and able to defend his father's work from all the activists that are putting their fingerprints on Lord of the Rings. If you created the story, you can do whatever you want with it. But in Lord of the Rings case, Amazon Studios, they did not create Lord of the Rings and therefore they do not have the right to change it. Period. Folks, this is not Galadriel. Amazon took Galadriel and they applied the modern day strong woman girl boss trend to her, even though Galadriel was not a warrior in Tolkien's work. This is not Elendil. In Tolkien's work, Elendil was a warrior. The Númenóreans were warriors. In the Rings of Power show, the Númenóreans look a bit more like adolescents, or they look a bit more like beta males. Speaking of which, this is not Elrond. This is a beta male. This is not a Lord of the Rings character. This is Slim Shady, pronouns they, them. This is Karl Marx. This is not a Lord of the Rings character. Amazon took the timeless classic work of Lord of the Rings, a story which is very black and white, very good and evil, and they applied this trend that modern entertainers love where they make everything morally gray, they blur good and evil, they make stories more nihilistic, nothing is good or evil, nothing is right or wrong anymore. No, Lord of the Rings and the works of Tolkien, they are very much good and evil. This is not Sauron.
People are going to fall in love with him and be like, I can change him.
And the activists working on Tolkien's work, they don't have any problems with altering it or changing it. How did Lenny Henry put it? We're telling the story now. In other words, we have the rights to the story, or the Second Age at least. Therefore, it's ours now. No, that world belongs to Tolkien. It does not belong to you. When you get the rights to adapt a story, you don't own the story. You're a steward of it. And your responsibility is to tell a good, respectful, faithful adaptation that the fans will love. Amazon, on the other hand, did not do that, and they had no intention of doing that. I mean, the level of disrespect that they showed towards Tolkien's work was disgusting. And this is the worst part about it.
The generation that comes after us now, this will be their memory of Tolkien. This will be their memory of the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power.
The worst part about Amazon making this Rings of Power show is that you have people out there who are unfamiliar with Tolkien's work, and their first experience ends up being Amazon's Rings of Power show, which is not a respectful, faithful adaptation of Lord of the Rings. And these new people, they're going to think that Amazon's woke, current-day perversion of Tolkien's work is actually Tolkien's work when it's not. People can say just be glad that you have the original books and just be glad that you have the Peter Jackson movies. I don't agree. Because Amazon is taking Tolkien's work and desecrating it, and you're going to have casual people out there thinking that Rings of Power is an accurate adaptation of Lord of the Rings when it's not. And as Sophie Anambet put it, the new generation, this is going to be their memory of Tolkien. And to be quite frank with you, I think that's what Amazon wants. So no, I think we Lord of the Rings fans, we have to call this out. And believe me folks, whenever Season 2 comes out, I guess it might be later this year or early next year, yeah, I'm going to be having a field day with it. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.